We all here, all the people here already know Mark because you've attended, if I remember correctly, you've all attended his presentations before and you know him from church. So, Mark, go ahead. It's all yours. And I would ask people to mute themselves, please.
Okay, so for those who don't know, scuba diving and underwater photography is a hobby of mine, and studying coral reef fish. And I do 2 or 3 dive trips a year to remote corners of the world, often the South Pacific. And let me set up screen sharing. Um, that, that, that. Let's see. Okay. Oh, whoops, that is the right photo. Okay, sorry. So today I'm talking about colors and patterns in reef fishes. Largely, it's an excuse to find a way to pull together a bunch of the photography, but I hope I will educate some of you along the way as well. So this first photo is a typical reef scene that's got 1,000 fish in it and a bunch of different colors. And people are often astonished by the amount of color on coral reefs. And for some of it, there are reasons. I will go into some of that. And some of it just seems we don't know. Nature likes to create beauty. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is camouflage. A lot of the color patterns are actually there for camouflage, so that predators have a harder time seeing the fish they're looking for. So start with one of the masters of camouflage. Does everyone even see the fish in this shot? Let's see. Does my cursor show up? Okay, it does. So if you can see where I'm circling the cursor, that's the eye of the fish. In fact, if I show you the same fish on a different background, that was a close-up of the fish, but he blends really well most of the places he sits. And there are a lot of fishes that are camouflaged this well. This one happens to be a tassel scorpion fish, who's maybe a foot long. So it's not a small fish, but they can be very difficult to see. Another fish, this one is a painted frogfish. The fish itself is kind of just an amorphous blob. It doesn't have a lot of shape. The eye is kind of obvious, is the dark spot here. So you might say, camouflage, this is a bright orange fish sitting in the mud. But these guys often sit next to orange sponges, and they look just like the sponges. And if they're in a place with scattered sponges, and they sit next to one, you can't find them anymore. So they're actually very effectively camouflaged for this. And this is the same kind of frogfish. They come in different colors. So this one is imitating a pink sponge, and he sits next to some of those sponges, and they're very hard to see. So again, here, this is the eye. The mouth is on this side, so he's facing to the right. And there are a lot of fish that are masters of camouflage like this. These ones I'm showing you are what are called lion weight predators. They will sit in one spot for hours at a time until an unsuspecting fish comes too close, and then they will swallow it in a sudden movement. And that's how they feed. So the camouflage is very important for those. This one is called a crocodile flathead. If you're not sure what you're looking at, the eye is here, the mouth is down here, so the fish is facing to the lower left. And he just matches the bottom he's sitting on. This one is harder to see than the others because even the eye is camouflaged. This is the close-up of the eye on another individual of this crocodile flathead. And instead of the eye having a round pupil, there this what's called lappets hanging down into the eye to disrupt the shape of the eye, so that even that is hard to see. And they have good vision in spite of that hanging down across the middle of their eye. I'm not quite sure how that works, but there are a number of fish that do this to hide their eyes as well. Those were all somewhat large fish. This one is called a dragonet, which is a very small fish. He's only 1.5 inches long, but again, very well camouflaged. Here's the same fish perched somewhere that's not camouflaged as well, so you can see the patterning on it. And some of these are quite brightly colored, but they're aware of their colors and often perch where they blend in, which serves as excellent camouflage. This one is a reef lizardfish, which is another lion weight predator, maybe 4 or 5 inches long. Here it's really obvious because it's on a Porides coral. But when the same fish is on a different background, they can blend in. This is actually 2 of them, probably a mated pair, just hanging out. And from any distance at all, they're all very difficult to see. So there's a lot of camouflage like this going on the reef, and it takes a lot of careful study to see the fishes. A lot of those were modeled. This one is actually a very tiny goby it's called a sponge goby, and it's perched on a sponge and becomes difficult to see again. The eyes on this one are kind of obvious, but the rest of the fish here just completely blends in. So those are examples of some of the traditional camouflage in reef fishes. But then there are others where here's a bright red fish. How could this possibly be camouflage, right? Well, one clue is in the really large eye. You notice almost the entire head is covered by the eye. This is a fish that's mostly active at night and has the large eye, so it can see when moonlight is basically the only light penetrating the ocean. I shot this during the day when it's resting and just hanging out. But it's camouflage because red light doesn't penetrate the ocean. Ocean water looks blue. And once you're deeper than 10 or 15 feet, there's basically nothing that looks red unless you bring artificial light with you to illuminate it. So at any depth, this red would just appear as black. So this is a fish that's can hunt at night, and anything else that's awake at night won't even see it because that red will just appear black. There are other fish. Again, these fish are close to 1 foot long. These are crescent-tailed big eyes. During the day, there's this obvious big school of red fish hanging out. They just kind of rest during the day, but at night, they're very active hunters and are basically very difficult to see because that red just appears black. Then there are other fish that you might not think have camouflage at all. This one is a long-nosed hawkfish, maybe 2 or 3 inches long, smallish fish, and it's red and white plaid. What could be more obvious sitting on a reef, right? Except this is a slightly unusual place for it to perch. More often, they perch on red corals like this. Now, all of a sudden, that plaid pattern helps it blend in. And again, if you remember, red appears black at any depth in the ocean. So if you turn that red to black, this is what it would look like underwater without me having brought bright strobes down for the photography. So that really does help the fish blend in. And again, another fish that seems outlandishly brightly colored. You have a turquoise fish with yellow polka dots. Seems really obvious on this background, right? But what this fish typically eats are the polyps of living corals like this. Now that same pattern of yellow spots on the turquoise background starts to blend in. And this is where these fish are most often seen. And these can be a couple inches long, but unless they're moving, they can be really difficult to spot when they're like this. So there's just lots of fish on the reef that seem brightly colored, but their colors are adapted for where they hang out. Oh, here's just reducing the color brightness a little to more what it tends to look like underwater. And again, it just becomes hard to see. This one is a leopard blenny, probably a 4 or 5 inch fish. They're not that small. They're often in pastel colors that seem kind of bright, depending on where you see it, but they also like to perch down amongst branching corals, and their pattern tends to blend into the coral polyps. So they can seem to disappear just by sitting still. And it's just kind of it's enough of a chaotic environment that it doesn't take a whole lot of camouflage before fish seem to just disappear and are hard to see. This one is, I just drew a blank. This is an ornate ghost pipefish. Again, a fish that's probably 3 inches long, and it has these little growths all over it called cirri, little thread-like things hanging off the body. Just for those who are a little confused by the fish, the eye is here where I'm circling with the cursor. The fish is facing to the left in this shot with a long snout here. It's got a couple fins at the mid-body and the tail off to the right. But it seems really obvious here. As a photographer, I try to find cases where I can photograph a fish like this where it's on a clear background so you can tell what it looks like. Where this is more often seen is somewhere like this, where all of a sudden it becomes almost invisible. This one is in front of what's called a feather star or crinoid. So it's a creature related to starfish that has long feathery arms. And these pipefish often hang out right next to them where they become invisible. The pipefish come in 4 or 5 different colors. You see them in pinks and yellows and browns, and they match the colors of where they're hanging out. So I've talked about some of those being somewhat large fish. This one is called a pygmy seahorse. This guy is only a 1/4 inch long. So something really tiny. I have trouble seeing them while I'm underwater. They're so small. A dive guide often helps me find these. I have a hard time finding them on my own, but to make it clear what you're seeing, the eye is the stark circle. So the fish is facing to the left. The snout is a little bit obscured there. This is the head, the body, and his tail is wrapped around a piece of coral here, and he's textured and colored just like the coral he's hanging on to. These pygmy seahorses weren't discovered until about 25 years ago. They were so well camouflaged that no one had noticed them until a coral researcher had taken some coral samples from the ocean and was studying them in a lab. And it turns out he had accidentally collected some of the seahorses with the coral and found them moving around in his sample tray. But yeah, there's something that a lot of divers want to see, and they're challenging to find. That's when it really pays to travel with a good guide who can help find things like this. So another form of camouflage is to look like something else that's uninteresting. What we're looking at here is a young peacock razorfish. So this one is pretty straightforward. You see the eye here in the mouth. So it's kind of a typical fish, except he's got this pennant coming off the head. I'm not quite sure why the young fish have a long pennant like that, but what these guys do, this is a fairly young juvenile that's probably only 1/2 inch long. They tend to hang out in shallow areas where there's the waves and the surge make the water move back and forth, and they drift back and forth with it and kind of look like just a dead leaf or piece of seagrass. And they can be really hard to spot if they're hanging out where there is plant material just sloshing around. So it turns out to be really effective camouflage in a small fish like this. And another kind of fish that does the same thing, this is a young rock mover wrasse. Again, so the eye and the mouth are kind of obvious, the fish's body, but he has these long streamers hanging off both above and below. And it looks like a piece of rotting plant matter. They hang out in places where there is seaweed that breaks apart and moves around with the currents. And they swim in a jerky fashion that looks like they're just being pushed around by the currents and can be very hard to spot, but they're quite spectacular when you get a good look at them. And again, this is a very small fish, maybe half an inch long. Completely different approach than to camouflage. You might say, a shark, why does it need camouflage? But of course, they're predators. And the best way to catch something is to sneak up on it. Sharks employ what's called counter shading. It's dark on top and pale on the bottom. And that's true of a lot of larger fish. That means if a shark swims below something, the dark shading on its back blends into the gloom below. If it swims above something and you look up at it, the pale belly matches the light coming down from the surface of the ocean. So they can be very difficult to see. Side on like this, yes, it's obvious. But here's another example. This is called a green jobfish. It's kind of large snapper. Again, counter shading, dark gray on top, light gray on the bottom. And these guys can be very hard to see. They can sneak up on you. And this is like a 4-foot fish. It's not a little one. So that's something that a lot of fish that hunt the edges of the reef, where it opens the ocean will do. So moving away from camouflage, something else that a lot of fish have is I've been trying to point out where the fish are in some of these shots where it might be difficult to see. I've often been pointing at the eye as the easiest thing to see. A lot of fish then try to either hide where their eye is or have one or more additional eyes to confuse what you're looking at. So this one here is a young, this is a leopard wrasse. Again, so this is a very small, it's a young fish. This one is probably less than half an inch long. Its actual eye is on the left side here, in the mouth. This is the body. There's a false eye spot on this side that almost exactly matches the color of its actual eye. So this is just coloration on a fin. Oh, that would confuse a predator that looks at it. There's like this pair of eyes looking at it. They might think it's a much larger fish and be afraid to try to pursue it to eat it. So false eyes can actually be very helpful for something like this. The two fish in this shot are young yellow-breasted wrasses. Not as small as the last one. These are maybe an inch long each. But so they're both facing to the right. So their actual eye is on the right side. And then towards the tail, there's a pair of false eye spots. This one does have two. It's just a little hard to see the lower one. And so again, to a predator, you see much larger eyes facing a different direction, and it becomes a little harder to predict what are you actually looking at, which way is the creature facing, how big is it? So false eyes are really helpful then for evading predators. A slightly different take on that. These are lattice butterfly fish. So these are probably 4-inch long each. And they're somewhat brightly colored. Butterfly fish make no attempt to hide. However, most of them, the eye is not obvious. That there's often a black stripe through the eye like there is on these. And that just means if a predator does look at them, it becomes less obvious which way is the fish facing. That if you attempt to chase it down, which direction is it going to go? If you if you can't tell which side is the head or not. So masking the eye is useful in that way as well. This one is called a copper banded butterfly, which has both a bar through the eye to make the actual eye less obvious, and then a false eye spot on the other side. So it's doing both things: hide the real eye, put a more obvious false eye somewhere else. Just help confuse predators. And lots of different fish employ this. This one is called a Randall shrimp goby. This fish is maybe 3 inches long. No real attempt to hide its actual eye, but then there's this much larger false eye on its back, painted onto the dorsal fin. And they draw attention to that by flicking their dorsal fin. So there's movement there around that false eye. And it just makes them look like something much larger, so that predators would hesitate to try to take them. And some fish can take this to extremes. This one has 4 false eyes and stripes through its real eye to try to hide it. This one is called a pygmy cave wrasse. It's a fairly small fish, maybe 1.5 inches long, that mostly lives in small caves. So it's rare to get a really good view of one, and it takes some effort to photograph. But that means when you do get just a glimpse of it back in a cave, you kind of see a bunch of eyes from those false eyes. And it can be a little, well, if you're not a photographer who's studied these and looking for them, it can be confusing to figure out what you're seeing if it just seems like a bunch of eyes back in there. So another approach to confusing predators, this isn't false eyes anymore, is just make your outline unusual or use coloration to make it hard to figure out what you're looking at. And one way that a number of fish use is to have 2 different colors. By being half black and half white, it becomes a little confusing what the outline is. If again, it's well lit in the photo, so it's kind of obvious. But if you're somewhere where it's not lit well, the fish is moving a little erratically, this half and half color becomes a bit confusing and harder to see the fish. This one particular one is called a half and half chromis, named because of the 2 colors. And it's a kind of smallish damselfish, maybe 1.5 inches long. This one is a larger fish, probably 4 or 5 inches long, called a bicolor rabbitfish. And most rabbitfish aren't colored like this, but this one is using this 2 contrasting colors to just confuse its outline a little and be a bit harder to spot and figure out what you're seeing. And yeah, these guys wander around the reef, and from any distance, you see a little bit of fish, but it's not quite obvious what you're looking at. And right, I think I said it's bicolor rabbitfish is the name of this one. A lot of fish employ this half and half scheme. This one's a bicolor goatfish. So very dark in the front, yellow and white in the back. The white stripe just further breaks up its outline a little. So yeah, any fish that have different patterns on different parts of the body are taking advantage of this. And it's just a way to not be as obvious what you are, even while being brightly colored. I went ahead and included these here. These are something that certainly as a diver are really obvious when encountered, and something that gets pointed out to to novice divers as well. These are called fire dartfish. They're maybe 2.5, 3 inches long and often hang out in pairs or small groups, kind of drifting in the water a couple inches above the bottom. And they're bright red on one end and white on the other. So they're really obvious. And it's not quite clear to me why they're so brightly colored. It may come back to what I was saying earlier about red appearing dark at depth. So you end up seeing the front half of the fish and the tail disappears in the dark is probably what's going on. But they have close relatives whose back end is purple and other colors as well. So sometimes there's a scheme that works well for a fish, and then there's variations on it that nature just likes creating colors. I don't know. I can't explain all of these. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Moving on to another scheme. There's a lot of mimicry on the reef. For all the different color patterns you see, often there are 3 or 4 different kinds of fish with the same pattern. And that serves a number of purposes. So this first example, this one is a small puffer fish called a black saddle toby. It's probably 2 to 3 inches long. Those of you who are into sushi may know that puffer fish is poisonous. So predators on the reef learn not to try to eat puffer fish, even though they're weak swimmers, because the liver and organs in the fish are poisonous. And if a predator eats one, it'll probably get sick. So they have a distinctive pattern to help predators learn to recognize and avoid these. So in this photo, we're looking at a different fish in a different family. This one's called a mimic filefish. And filefishes aren't poisonous. They're not dangerous in any ways. And they're also not very strong swimmers, but they mimic the pattern very effectively of the black saddle toby I just showed you. This is a case of what's called Batesian mimicry. It means something that's not dangerous mimics something that is dangerous so that predators will avoid them. And to give you an example, another example of this, the upper fish in here is the mimic, the lower one is the puffer. The patterns can be very close. You often have to take a pretty careful look to tell which is which. And the way you can tell them apart here, the puffer fish has small fan-shaped fins on the dorsal and anal fins, whereas the filefish has long fins that go half the length of the body for the dorsal and anal fins. But the coloration and pattern is almost exactly the same. And it's pretty rare to see the two of them right next to each other like this, but I particularly liked when I saw it, because then you can draw attention to how similar they are. Another example, this fish is called the lemon peel angelfish. Angelfishes tend to be brightly colored and aren't generally attacked by predators. They have a lot of sharp spines, and so are generally left alone. This is probably like a 4-inch fish. This one isn't an angelfish at all. This is called a mimic surgeonfish. And but it's a pretty effective mimic of the other one. Bright yellow, blue outlines on the face. And the mimic surgeonfish, only the young ones are mimics. As they grow up, this is what an adult mimic surgeonfish looks like. It's got its own distinctive look. But going back, the juvenile tends to copy angelfishes because young fish are more vulnerable. So by imitating something that's predators don't generally attack, they're less likely to attack it. By the time they're an adult, like this one, surgeonfish are called surgeons because they have a very sharp spine at the base of the tail right here, which is like a scalpel, and that's where the name surgeon comes from. Another example, so the mimic surgeons mimic a number of different kinds of angels. This is an angelfish. This one's called a pearl scale angelfish. This is another mimic surgeonfish that's mimicking the pearl scale angelfish. And I've seen them mimic 4 or 5 different kinds of angelfish. To figure out what you're looking at, you have to look at subtleties of the head shape and the way the fins come together. That sometimes the colors are an extremely good mimic of that. And I mentioned that the surgeons have this sharp spine that they can use to defend themselves as adults. This is another kind of surgeonfish. This one's, I just drew a blank on the name of it. Oh, it's called an orange spine unicorn fish, is its common name. The bright orange here is drawing attention to these sharp spines. So the fish is saying, I'm dangerous, I have these sharp spines, here they are, to make sure that nothing bothers it. And not much attacks adult surgeonfish because of these sharp spines. Another kind of mimicry. So the big fish in this shot is a masked grouper, and he's being cleaned. You may or may not know that there are small fish around coral reefs that specialize in cleaning other fish, that fish can't groom themselves, that if they get parasites or have minor injuries or flaking scales, they have no way to remove that. So it's evolved that there are small fish that will groom other fishes. And these 2 long thin fish here with the yellow and blue stripes are called cleaner wrasses. So this one, these are both working on this grouper. He has his mouth and gills wide open like that. The cleaners will actually go into their mouth and pick at the inside of the gills and the teeth to keep that clean. And this is a service that most fish appreciate. They will come where cleaners hang out to be cleaned like this. Here's a close-up of the cleaner wrasse, and the very typical coloration for that cleaner wrasse in Fiji. This fish isn't a cleaner wrasse at all. This is a fang blenny. So they pretend to be cleaner wrasses and are often pretty good at duplicating the colors of the local cleaner wrasses. But from the name fang blenny, they have sharp teeth that are not right at the very end of the snout, but below the snout. And they will pretend to be a cleaner, and a fish will come and present themselves in front of it. And then the fang blenny will take a bite out of the fish and then dart away. So they're taking advantage of that coloration, not for protection. So rather than, I mentioned Batesian mimicry, that's Muellerian mimicry, is when something that's dangerous uses mimics something else to further its aims rather than for protection. And these guys can be very hard to tell apart when you see them on the reef. And so a lot of fish who want to be cleaned aren't quite sure if they're getting real cleaners or not. And it's a rude awakening when you think something's going to help pick parasites, instead takes a bite out of you. Another kind of mimicry, this fish is called a comet. It's like, oh, probably like 4 or 5 inches long. Dark with the white spots and a false eye. So you might say, okay, this is just your false eye thing. They tend to lurk in openings in the reef and small caves, the same kind of places that eels hang out. And with that eye spot and their body pattern, they look like an eel, the head of an eel hanging back there. So nothing is likely to get too close to them because eels are dangerous. So this is the kind of eel that they're mimicking. And it's pretty effective for a fish that isn't a strong swimmer to not have to worry that anything's going to try and eat it, because they'll think, oh, this is an eel that'll swallow me if I get too close. This is not about mimicry then. Oh, yeah, I didn't do a title slide for this. So some fish that are dangerous advertise their dangerousness with bold patterns. And so this one is a clown trigger. The triggerfish have sharp teeth and strong jaws and are also very strong swimmers. So nothing's going to hassle the triggerfish. And by having a bold, obvious pattern, they're just saying, watch out for me, don't hassle me, is what that means in this case. Another example, this is a Titan triggerfish. This is something that divers learn what these look like and avoid them, because during nesting season, which is several months, it's dangerous for scuba divers to get near these. They defend their nests and will chase after divers and will take a bite out of you if you're not careful. So again, a bold pattern, no attempt to hide what they are. Oops, okay, I thought I had a close-up of that. Just for a fish that's big and capable of defending itself. So far, I haven't shown a lot of bright colors. When you get into courtship, is where a lot of that comes into play. So a fish that's fairly common in a lot of places, or a type of fish in general, are referred to as flasher wrasses. And they often look like loose schools of small reddish brown fish that are kind of nondescript. If you look carefully at this photo, the one in the center has a slightly different pattern from the others. What happens, that one in the center is a male, the other 5 in the shot are females. And these fish, the males keep harems. So one male will actually gather and kind of take control of a group of females. He will defend a territory where all those fish hang out and want to be the only fish that spawns with those. And part of how he does that, so this sort of brownish fish that has a few stripes can do this. And that's why they're called flasher wrasses, is in literally a tiny fraction of a second, they go from dull to really bright colors and they flare their fins. And they do this as a way of expressing dominance. So if other males get too close, they will go up to them and do this. They circle the females, flashing bright colors to keep all their harem of females together. There are a number of different kinds of flasher wrasses. So I forget the name of the previous one. This one is a yellowfin flasher wrasse. But when he's not flashing, just a dull reddish brown. But literally, in a tiny fraction of a second, they go from that to brightly colored and flare their fins like this. They can dart around like that and then fade back to brown. And I find them fascinating fishes to watch. They're challenging to photograph because they tend to only flash the bright colors when they're moving. This is another one. This is a red fin fairy wrasse, which is closely related and has the same behavior pattern. So again, this is the male. The females tend to be dull. This one is a solar fairy wrasse. And when not trying to express dominance, that blue fades to just a pale gray. And the fish is kind of nondescript, but then when it wants to draw attention, it flashes these bright colors. This one is Lubbock's fairy wrasse. Again, the male with the bright colors, the female would be dull. So there are a number of other families as well that maintain harems that do this. Parrotfishes are one of those. So here's a really bright, obvious fish. This one is called a Bleeker's parrotfish. These can get fairly large. This one could be a foot long or more. And parrotfish have a complicated life cycle. That juveniles have one coloration. As they grow up from juvenile to adult, there's two different adult colorations referred to as initial phase and terminal phase. The initial phase of Bleeker's parrotfish looks like this. So fairly dull, not a lot of color. And the pattern is actually good for hiding. It's a little bit like camouflage. And then most of the initial phase parrotfish are female. After some time, as they get older, some of those will transition to terminal phase and become functional male. So they actually change gender as they age. And when they make that change, the colors will change. This fish will then look like this. So parrotfish, they keep harems. The male wants to be the only one who spawns with his group of females, and the bright color is part of how they track the who the other fish are around them and express their dominance. Unlike the flasher wrasses, terminal phase parrotfish are always brightly colored. So these two were the, let's say, the Bleeker's parrotfish. This one is called the pale nose parrotfish, which may, the name may not make sense because it has a dark purple snout here with that and the yellow and everything. This is the terminal phase. The initial phase, however, is gray and lighter on the front, and that's where the name pale nose comes from. So an initial phase parrotfish, as this one gets older, it might turn to these colors. I say might, it's not clear that all of them ever make the transition. And to further complicate the things, sometimes there will be fishes that maintain the initial phase dull coloring, but become functional male, and then will sneak into a harem to spawn with the females there. So there's a lot of complication going on here, and it can actually be fascinating to watch all the activity going on in the late afternoon when fish tend to spawn. There are other ways that courtship plays into colors. So these are blue-green chromis. There are fish that are often present in huge numbers on the reef, and males and females look the same. So I couldn't tell you which in this group are male or female until it becomes time to spawn. And then males who are looking to spawn and trying to interest the local females adopt what are called courtship or nuptial colors. So this fish, which is yellow with blue and black spots and a black tail, is a male of these who normally looks like this, but on a moment's notice, he can change his colors. And it's interesting to watch fish change colors that quickly. I'm not even quite sure the mechanism. But so yeah, this is a blue-green chromis male who's trying to convince nearby females to spawn with him. There are other fish have different ways that they do courtship. So most of what you see in this shot, the purplish fish, are called scalefin anthias, and those are the males. The orange fish are also scale fin anthias, and those are the females. So here the males and females look quite a bit different. And these don't so much keep harems, but you tend to see males in one group and females in another until it gets to be close to spawning time, and then they mix. And I also see the grayish fish in the middle is an interloper or something else. That's a turnip chromis. But yeah, so these fish are making it really obvious their gender. Other anthias do the same thing. So this one is a red fin anthias. The male's the brightly colored one in the middle. The dollar fish below him is a female. And some anthias do keep harems, so like the red fin anthias tend to do that. So he's probably trying to corral a group of females and keep them near him all the time. And that's why he's showing the bright colors like that. Another anthias, this one's called square spot anthias, for the purple spot on the side. This is a male, very bright. And these guys generally keep harems. This is the female. So kind of like the other anthias I showed, the males are pink and purple. The females are yellow or orange. And that's true of a lot of the anthias, where the males and females are different. And most of cases where in species that keep harems, that's true, the males and females are different. Then there are fish that are brightly colored, and I have no clue why. But I wanted to include some of these as well. They were doing good on time. This is called a neon damsel. Bright iridescent blue, can't miss it. Why? There's no hiding. And you have this kind of color. They're often in groups. So like this shot, you can see 5 of the neon damsels. So there is safety in numbers, and that's why a lot of fish school. But when you're that bright, it's really obvious. Nature likes something beautiful sometimes, is all I can say. Then you get fish like this. Small fish, only a couple inches long, very weak swimmer, but he's brightly colored with an obvious pattern. This one's called a mandarin fish. They tend to live down in the crevices in the coral, and other than its spawning time, are very hard to see. So I've done a few dives over the years where we specifically go to where we know these fish hang out right at dusk when they're going to spawn, and then they rise up out of the coral. Otherwise, they're almost impossible to see, but they're brightly colored. And I've kept these in aquariums as well, because I think they're really beautiful. And why there's a fish with a frog face and a paisley pattern, never know. Some other crevice dwellers are also brightly colored. This one is called an oblique line dottyback. It's a fish that spends most of its time hidden in crevices and under rocks and such, rarely out in the open, but it's brightly colored. This one's a male. The females are a little bit differently colored, but still bright, just got more blue and some other colors in it. And I couldn't tell you why they're brightly colored. There are other fish that have obvious colors and patterns that I couldn't tell you what they're trying to signal as well. Maybe this one is trying to be a disruptive outline in different patterns to be harder to see, but they drift in the edges of open water and tend to be really obvious. So I can't imagine they're really trying to hide. This one's called a pajama cardinal fish. This is something else that people keep in aquariums sometimes because they have an interesting pattern and are pretty easy to keep, but They're not dangerous, they're not predators, they just kind of hang out. You may notice they have a largish eye. They hunt at night, but they're making no attempt to hide, and I don't know why, but they're brightly colored and they're interesting. They're called pajama cardinals because traditional pajamas with polka dots, I guess you could imagine they're wearing that. I don't know. Other fish are brightly colored and seem to draw attention to themselves. This one is a striped surgeonfish. So I talked about surgeons earlier, that there is a scalpel here. They're not drawing attention to that scalpel. This fish is one that lives right up where the waves are breaking and the waves and surge on the reef crest. So it's a high energy environment. The water is moving a lot. Anything that's there is in constant motion because you would have to fight the currents to stay in one spot. So they're very fast swimmers, constantly in motion. And a lot of fish in that environment are brightly colored. There's no point trying to hide, you're just moving a lot. And I think they're particularly beautiful, but they're hard to observe because they're under the crashing waves. So as a diver, you can't get too close to there. So you have to keep an eye out for when they venture away from their most common habitat to get close and get a photo like this. Other fish are brightly colored, who knows? These are emperor angelfish. They're big fish, they're 1.5 feet long. This is something that people keep in aquariums when they have large aquariums as well, just because it's a striking pattern. So I mentioned earlier, not much attacks angelfish, but I still have no idea why they have such an obvious pattern to draw attention to themselves. But a lot of angelfish are seen in pairs, that they tend to form long-term couples. And this brings us back to the reef. So here's a typical reefscape. Seems to be a riot of color, but after talking about this, can look at it. The fish that are orange, pink, and purple up above the reef, those are anthias, and drawing attention to whether they're male or female to help keep the harems together. There are brownish fish up there, which if they feel threatened and get down near the reef, they become hard to see. So they have that kind of camouflage. There are bluefish further down that are just obvious, don't know why. And if you look really carefully, there's some fish down next to the coral that are pretty well camouflaged. And this is what goes on a reef. And wow, I made it through that in under an hour. That's my talk.
Thank you very much. That was extraordinary. Anybody has any questions?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Kathy?
Yeah.
A question I had, Mark, was how close are you to those fish when you're photographing them? Because some of them were so tiny, or what kind of a lens must you have to be able to get close, or both?
So the small fish, I often have my camera only a couple inches from them.
Ah,
And so like the really small ones, like that pygmy seahorse, I have a special close-up lens on the front, and that lens is within an inch of the seahorse. Is the only way to get a photo like that.
pretty awesome.
And even the big fish, like that shark, I was probably 3 feet from it. Any further away, and you don't get that much detail and color because the ocean doesn't transmit light well.
Right.
So yeah, the secret to getting good photos like that is get as close as you can, then get closer.
And then you have a strobe light as well. So you're coming up real close to these little bitty things with a light and a camera. That's pretty awesome.
Yes. Oh, I don't know if I can find it quick enough.
Mark, yeah, do you have a picture of your gear or a picture of you actually doing this?
That's what I was just looking for.
Mhm.
I should have had one of those ready to go. Oops, that's not me. Well, let me, share this again. Share screen.
Oh, my.
So
Oh,
this isn't-
wow.
this isn't me. This is a friend of mine. Whoops. This is but he has a similar rig to mine. So
Wow.
there's two strobes that are mounted on arms, so I can move them around where they are relative to the camera. The camera is a regular SLR camera that's in a special underwater housing, and then there's a glass dome over the lens.
Uh-huh.
So he might be trying to shoot the little black and white fish in that anemone. He's what, 18 inches away from it,
Mhm.
and would probably get even closer to get a good shot.
Mm.
You mentioned that some fish would bite, so the divers wouldn't go that close. Would they bite through the neoprene? I mean, would they bite through the suit or just your hands or what?
So there are a number of fish that want to defend their territories and might nip at you if you get too close. I don't mean to make it sound like that happens all the time, but there are a few kinds of fish that do that. Most often when they have eggs, they're trying to protect.
So they could bite through your breathing tube or things
So
like
the Titan triggerfish, the one I made that comment about, can be dangerous. They can draw blood.
Mm.
It doesn't happen often, but they're enough of a threat that divers tend to avoid them. Whereas some of the damselfish, which are smallish fish, they're only a couple inches, can be very feisty and don't like you getting very close if they have eggs that they've laid. And they will come nip at you, but aren't gonna hurt you. They certainly couldn't bite through neoprene.
Mark, you have shown us some really remarkable images, and I know that you're working on a book. How close are you to accomplishing that project?
So my book.
Mm.
Oh, weird. This
Oh,
was published in 2019.
oh my God.
In fact, the cover photo is the last one I showed you in the presentation.
Right, yeah.
Wow.
So it was self-published. Unfortunately, about 6 months before the pandemic, when everyone quit traveling for scuba diving for the next 2 or 3 years.
Mm.
So the launch didn't go all that well. I've sold a few hundred copies, and I'm kind of working on a second edition to correct some mistakes and make some additions, which I will release at some point, and then make another advertising push.
Uh-huh.
One thing I really admire in the naming of the fish is that nobody tries to name the fish after themselves. They name it in a very descriptive manner.
That's not true. That colorful parrotfish I showed you was Bleeker's parrotfish. It was named for Peter Bleeker. Quite a few of them are named after people. And especially the scientific names of a lot of them are named for people, but they might have a common name that's different.
Hmm.
And this is currently a big topic among taxonomists, not just with fish. There's a long history of naming things for people, what are referred to as patronymics.
Mhm.
And what happens years later, you learn, oh, this person we named this thing after was a slave owner, did this or that horrible thing. We don't want to honor them anymore. And there's been a lot of pushback on that. There are rules about how names are given and can be changed. So it's really complicated to change some of that. And of course, there are people who don't want to. there is a beetle named after Adolf Hitler.
Hmm.
And there are a couple things in the past 10 years have been named after Donald Trump.
Oh my God.
And most get named either after one of the people who helped discover it or the person who bankrolled the expedition to discover it.
Hmm.
There's a lot like that. But so like the AOU, the American Ornithological Union, which is the organization that oversees names of birds in the Americas, recently declared that they are actually going to change the common names of all of the birds that are named after people. It's a long and complicated process. It's not just going to happen overnight.
Mhm.
But some people say, well, why not only change the names of the most gregarious cases, but who's going to decide what person is terrible and we should change the name and this person's not so bad? And even James Audubon, who's the father of American birding, did some kind of bad things in his life. And does that mean we shouldn't honor him anymore? So most people are actually complicated. They did good things and bad things, and deciding which names should be changed is difficult. So the only real way to approach that is to say no more naming after people at all. Okay.
Oh,
Go on.
well, that's fascinating, Mark. First off, that was absolutely wonderful presentation. Do you have, this gets kind of more of a scientific thing, but you seem to, you're so knowledgeable on this. Do you not understand the chemistry of the ability of the fish to change their colors? You know, I see octopus do this. I mean, but this fact that they can just change their color, you know, what is that?
I know what the mechanism is in octopus and squid. For the most part in fish, they can intensify or fade their colors, but not actually change them.
Okay.
Whereas octopus can actually create patterns and change patterns that weren't otherwise there. So for the most part, fish can go very pale, they can go have a strong pattern, but they can't change from one pattern to another.
Okay.
And I'm not sure what the mechanism is, but it's just to intensify or pale the pattern.
It's phenomenal.
Where are you going next?
Well, I'm just back from the Red Sea in Egypt. I got back
Wow.
Saturday.
So we're going to see next something about that.
Maybe.
Hopefully.
My next trip I have booked is in December. I'm going to the Solomon Islands, which I've been to 3 times before. This is my 4th time there. And Solomon Islands has a lot of diversity. There's a lot of interesting fish there. Right. So I get people commonly ask, do I go to the Caribbean? And how is the Red Sea? Very quickly about marine diversity. There's an area called the Coral Triangle. If you draw a triangle connecting Indonesia, the Solomon Islands, and the Philippines, and that will completely encircle New Guinea, that area has the most diversity of anywhere on Earth in the oceans. The further you get from there, the less diversity there is. So Fiji, my favorite place to go, is 1,500 miles from there. And has 2/3 the number of fish that you can find inside the Coral Triangle. By the time you get to the Red Sea, which is 6,000 miles from there, I only saw 180 different kinds of fish in my week in the Red Sea, whereas I get 500 or 600 different kinds of fish when I'm diving near the Coral Triangle. By the time you're all the way to the Caribbean, which is as far as you can get from the Coral Triangle and still be in the tropics, I might only see 70 or 80 different species of fish in a week's diving. So as someone who's into fish taxonomy and wants to see a lot of different kinds of fish, that's why I'm bored with the Caribbean and go to the South Pacific.
Have you been to the Ryukyu Islands near Okinawa and so forth?
I have not. I would like to, and I've talked to people about that. So Okinawa is what Americans call what the Japanese
Yeah,
call.
Ryukyu.
So it's the same place. It's not, they're near
No.
each other.
I
It's two
know,
names
I
of the
know.
same
I've
thing.
been there. And what I have seen is that in some areas where there were lots of ships sunk, actually, I didn't see much in ways of corals. But however, what we did, by the way, I did not. We went in some kind of a submarine
Mhm.
with windows, and around the the ships that had gone down, loads of different types of fishes appeared, but it all looked very blue to me, and it's very, very difficult from the submarine to take pictures, obviously, but I thought it was very interesting. I wonder if you would be interested in what's there for you.
I mean, I know a little bit about what's there, so that's area would be called subtropical. You're kind of on the edge of tropical and getting more towards cooler water. So what you see is different there.
Yes.
And I mean, certainly some of the same tropical species are found there, but there's also some that are different. In terms of seeing much color, did they have floodlights on on the outside of the submarine illuminating?
Yes, they did. They did. Yes.
Okay, so you should have then been able to see whatever color is there. There'll be less color in subtropical regions, but there certainly should be some.
We saw some, and some of the fish looked different. Well, it was a long time ago for me, but some of the fish looked quite different from what you showed. So that's why I wondered if you had ever gone there. And what I found interesting is that the fish were using for camouflage, they were using some of the old ships, parts of the ships. I mean, it wasn't coral, and things had grown on the ships.
Right. So when there are shipwrecks, pretty quickly things tend to grow over the man-made surfaces. And I'm not a big fan of shipwrecks for the sake of shipwrecks. I know people who love diving shipwrecks, but they can also be interesting for the marine life that lives on and around them. And by the time a ship has been there more than 10 years, there will be a fair bit of growth. And when you visit older wrecks, like I've been on World War II wrecks, sometimes other than the overall shape, you don't see much of the ship at all because it's just completely overgrown with stuff.
Hmm.
Yeah, Richard? You're muted.
I just like to point out how Unitarian Universalist the ocean is with those harems and the transgender fish, and how Florida legislators ought to know what's natural and what's not natural by these kind of insights into how other animal groups are aligning themselves.
Right. And there are actually other kinds of fish that are matriarchies. So like clownfish, like Nemo, the largest, most dominant fish in an anemone will be female.
Hmm.
The subdominant, the next one down is male, and all the others are juvenile.
Well, we know that first case.
Yeah, and
The world is run by females. We will have peace.
all right.
Yeah, I was thinking our Republicans should know about the wonderful life that goes on in the fish kingdom, and that we are all connected, right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
I was thinking about that too, Richard.
Sally, did you have a question?
Yeah, you had said that most of your photography took place in Fiji, and I noticed that almost all the coral backgrounds were white, which is really concerning. Do you want to comment on that?
So I was trying to choose photos that made it easy to see some of these fish that otherwise are well camouflaged. So it's not that most of the coral is white, it's that I chose photos with white backgrounds so that it's easier to see the fish. The photos I showed were from a wide variety of places, not just Fiji. I was just looking for examples of different behaviors rather than highlighting what's found in a particular place.
Well, what is your comment about
So
like the coral in South Florida or the coral in Fiji? What I've heard that in Australia the corals are really under siege. Have someone who has been underwater. What do you think?
So there are places where the reefs are very degraded and dying. There are places where the reef is pushing and damaged, but holding on. There are places that are actually in very good shape. It varies a lot from place to place, and kind of what's happening. Coral reefs are actually fairly resilient. So if there are one or two forms of stress, they can recover. It's when you get 3 or 4 different stressors that continue and continue that the reef starts to die and not recover. So some of the more common stresses on various reefs are rising sea temperatures. A lot of corals can't tolerate water warmer than 80, 83, 84 degrees. So places where it gets warmer than that, coral can die. Chemical pollution is a big problem. And when I say chemical pollution, it's not just the weird chemicals from our cosmetics and sunscreen, although that is a problem around tropical resorts. But the biggest problem there is agricultural runoff. The Gulf of Mexico has a dead spot 100 miles wide where the Mississippi River empties into it because fertilizers and pesticides from the Midwest agriculture runs down the Mississippi and into the Gulf, and it's killed everything. And this is part of why the Great Barrier Reef off Australia is not doing well, because Australia is an industrialized nation with industrialized farming. So residue from that farming washes off the land into the ocean. So right, I mentioned warming and chemical pollution. Other stresses include mechanical damage, either from storms or from human activity like ship anchors or divers who are sloppy and kick and damage the reef. Then there are introduced species that cause problems. There are others I'm not thinking of right now. But so Fiji is my favorite place to dive. I'm there about once a year. And the reefs are doing really well there. There has been bouts of coral bleaching. So when there's an El Nino year, they talk about the weather in North America from El Nino. The same times that's happening here, the water gets warmer in the South Pacific. And there have been a couple times it's gotten warm enough in Fiji that there's been some widespread bleaching and a lot of coral dies. But because there aren't a lot of stresses on those reefs, it comes back. And if you dive the year after that, you'll see small bits of coral that are growing. And 5 or 6 years later, you'd never know it had happened. It's anything that died has been overgrown and it looks great. It's a common misconception that coral grows incredibly slowly. Some of it does. So the big mound-like coral that makes the foundation of the reef, yes, that grows incredibly slowly, less than an inch a year. But the smaller branching corals, which are the most obvious coral on the top of the reef, those grow really quickly. And those are what, following bleaching, will overgrow anything that has died. And 4 or 5 years later, it looks fine again. So it's not the case that all coral is that slow to grow.
I understand that in Australia, they have, and elsewhere actually, they are doing coral reseeding. So in laboratories, they harvest little pieces of different types of corals, and they're trying to raise them in higher temperature or whatever, and then reseed, and it's only been partially successful. It's hard.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and there have been quite a few setbacks. So to get a little more into the science, coral, the way it feeds is there's algae that lives in the tissues of the coral called zooxanthellae that photosynthesizes from sunlight, and the sugars it produces from that photosynthesis feed the coral. Most corals can't survive without that. And what happens when the water gets too warm is that the algae living in the tissues of the coral dies, and then the coral starves. So that's the mechanism behind coral bleaching. And some of the people that are trying to combat this are in laboratory or in farms in bays, are growing coral. And there are different strains of algae that can live in the tissues of the coral. And some of them are more heat tolerant than others. So they're trying to produce clippings of coral that'll be more heat tolerant to then go plant on the reef. And there are cases where it has worked. There are cases where it's been a complete failure. There are cases where it looks great until something else happens and wipes it all out. So it's not at all clear that that's really going to solve anything, but it's one of several things that are being pursued.
What you're saying that basically coral is living in symbiosis with an algae the way lichen is.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Richard?
I just want to ask man to man, because some of these creatures seem sci-fi. Have you ever been really shocked by what you've seen and had trouble focusing your attention on what you're looking at?
Certainly when I was newer to this, that happened all the time. With 25 years experience studying coral reefs, I will certainly see a fish or something and not know what its name, exactly what it is. But at this point, I'll see something and go, oh, that's some weird green algae I haven't seen, but I'm sure I know what class of creature it is. I still will stumble upon a view that's just amazing and forget the camera and just watch.
Mm-hmm.
Most recently, that happened to me Monday with the eclipse. I was all set to take all these photos, and I spent most of the 2 minutes just staring.
Yes.
And Jean?
So, Mark, I did a quick Google of the Coral Triangle. It was just fascinating. I could see a map there. So it mentioned that there's lots of species there, but some that they don't even know about or have been cataloged or identified. So my question to you is, one, how many species have you seen? And secondly, is there an elusive one that you're hoping to see that you're how do you know if you're seeing something for the first time, that no one else has seen? But anyway, are you in the pursuit of something?
So, I should know this. There are, I think, there are like 100,000 known species of fish, and it's thought that may only be a third of what's in the ocean.
Right.
fish taxonomy is very, very much a work in progress. I mentioned I'm working on revisions to my book. Probably 20% of the fish in that book have had their names changed in the past 4 years.
Oh,
Um,
like Africa.
so the early taxonomists figured out what's related to what because they look similar, and you dissect it and see how the bones are shaped and such. In the past 25, 30 years, they're now using microbiology, DNA analysis. to
DNA
figure out
analysis.
what's related to what. And are discovering, oh, what we used to think was a widespread species found all the way from the Red Sea to California is 5 different species that look similar, but their DNA shows they're different.
Mm.
And things like that have happened. So a lot of the name changes are, oh, these things that look similar are different, or wow, this looks kind of like this other thing, but it's not closely related at all. We have to create a whole new family to put it in because it's just not related to anything we've seen before. So there's a lot of that going on in fish taxonomy. In terms of what I'm seeing, what I'm looking for, I do keep a list of everything I've seen. It's in the vicinity of 2,000 species of coral reef fish I have on that. And there are certainly wish list items. I really started focusing that when I wrote the book. There's about 850 species in the book, and I had photos of most of them, but there was about 20 photos in the first edition that I had to get from other people because I had never photographed or maybe even not even seen a species that I wanted to include in the book. And there's more of that in the second edition. So high on my wish list are ones I want to include in the book that I've not seen. There are also what's referred to as charismatic megafauna. So large animals that are interesting looking that people like to see, those always get the most attention, especially from the general population. And there are some of those that I've still never seen. So those are always really high on my list. It wasn't until October when I was on the Great Barrier Reef that I finally saw my first leopard shark. 20 some odd years of diving, I had not seen a leopard shark.
Well, thank you very much. And we're really delighted. Again, we're always delighted.
Yeah, thank
isn't
you,
it?
Mari.
And we're